So we were talking about all these sort of definitions about how governments spend money differently than private individuals. It's important to recognize that there are things that we just simply can't do that private individuals can. So the budget is also hotly contested because it deals with individual government spending in agencies. And so there's some things that are really just political choices. Things that we really, really value, like which programs get funded and which ones don't. Any new president, any new Congress is going to come in and they're going to want, a particular set of funding for programs. For example, HIV or AIDS prevention was one of the Clintons' programs. The Bush's programs was about teaching and education. There's a whole bunch of things that we say we really, really want to do this because it's right for the country, it's right for the people. Those are that's one political choice that is made in the budget making process. In other words, what are we going to spend money on? The other thing is, what's the relative importance of a specific institution? And so we can see that in its annual budget. For example, President Reagan cut the budget of the EPA by 50% when he came in. He said, we don't really actually like that program, we don't like that agency, so we want to get rid of it. So in that budget making process, you get to see this tug of war between the executive branch and Congress, who has budget power. And prior to the end of World War I, Congress did the budget all by itself. That's the taxing authority inside the House of Representatives, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But in 1921, that shift went to the president, who's the manager of the executive branch, to first craft a budget. So he gathers, using the Office of Management and Budget, information from each agency. He puts together a tentative budget. He sort of says, hey, this is what we actually really need in all these agencies. And then he submits it to Congress. Then Congress marks it up. They may do what he wants. They may not. But at least it's a way for him to say, this is an important agency. This is an important initiative. This is what I've seen as we've been managing. And this is where I think, some of the spending should be. Ultimately, that responsibility for the budget goes to Congress, and then the president will have to turn around and sign it as a law. So when we think about budgeting, what do you do at home? Obviously, you live on an income, I live on an income, and it's more or less fixed. There's not a lot of variation. It's not as much as I want. So what do you do? The first is, a lot of people will say, well, this is how much money is going to come in. We divide the money between all of our expenses, housing, insurance, car payment, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then you put the highest rank important items at the top. They just get paid first, and down near the bottom, if we have money left over, we can pay for these things. But when the money runs out and it's over. That's how most logical private families and people budget. But the other way that people can do it, figure out where the money's going, is they just start buying stuff that they want and need on a credit card. And then when the credit card is maxed out, or when they can't pay their credit card bills, then they stop. They just find money to pay it, or they don't, and that's a problem. Well, interestingly, you would think that A is what the government would do. We're going to bring in this money, we're going to divide all the money between the places that we want, and then we stop spending when that money runs out. Well, that is kind of what the state government does, because they can't just create money, but the federal government can create money. And so they just sort of budget. They have to plan what they want to spend, but if they want to spend more than they have, they just simply can. And Congress gets to set their own limit, their debt limit, about what's excessive. And so how does that really work? When we talked about, fixing how much money it was going to come in, that's top-down budget making. We know that this is how much we're going to get. We start dividing our expenses, and then when the money runs out, the money runs out. Top-down budget making is an approach where the managers of each agency say, well, this is how much money we're going to get. We're going to spend money here, 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 and here. And then once we hit this limit about our budget, we stop spending. That means that we have to, really stay in these budget requests for all these different agencies. This is very, very, very rare. It doesn't really happen at the federal level. At the state and local levels, it does kind of happen because they want to stay under their fixed budgets. At the federal level, what often happens is what's called bottom-up budget making. Bottom-up budget making is this idea that, well, we're providing goods and services right now, and what we're going to want to do is, in order to expand some of those services that we provide, we have to increase the budget somewhere. Well, if we increase the budget somewhere, then other agencies start sort of fighting about whether or not they're going to get a budget increase as well. So think about something like the police department. If we were to increase spending in the police department, the fire department would say, well, hey, look, they got 3% increase in the budget. I need 3% increase in the budget because we're both important. And then the IT department says, well, but I actually need 5% increase in the budget because, technology is expensive and it's going to save us a bunch of money. And then if we say, well, IT is going to get a 5% budget increase and the police and the fire department are going to only get 3%, they say, oh, no. We're way more important than IT because we save people's lives and save people's houses. And so the idea about increasing the budget a certain percent at a time is incrementalism. We're going to increase budgets a little bit by a small increment. And then each of these other agencies start looking around and then we get these sort of political fights about, well, your increment is bigger than my increment. Your increase is going to be bigger than my increase. Well, are you more important than I am? And what ends up happening is we start just growing the size of the budget over and over and over and over again, sort of all across the board. And since we don't have a fixed cap because we're in the federal government, it doesn't really matter. We can spend more than we have. Now, incrementalism is this sort of central theory about bottom-up budget making. Asking agencies at the lowest levels how much they actually need. They'll all want to ask more. Then we compile all those requests into a budget. Well, it does happen at the federal level, but it sort of assumes that nobody cares about the total level of spending, which isn't exactly true. And it's got this really bad problem of creating conflict inside agencies and between agencies because those increments reflect political power of those agencies. And so bottom-up budget making does happen. It's a central theory about how we do budgeting at the federal government, but it's got massive problems and it can lead to big debts. So because this occurs so frequently, we've tried all sorts of different things to reform incrementalism. Management by objectives. So it essentially says, if we're going to hit this thing, we need you to, tell us how you're going to get there, and then we'll add to your increment. We've done zero-based budgeting, which is like, we're going to cut your budgets down to the very minimum. You're going to have to justify every additional spending that you want. The PPBS was a different one. It doesn't really matter. I mean, there's like so many of these things. Some of the more modern ones was George H.W. Bush did a flexible freeze. So if you wanted spending in one area, you had to cut from somewhere else. So that sort of fixed a cap on the budget spending. George W. Bush used something different. He said, well, what we're going to do is we're going to tie agency budget requests to how their agency's performing. And so they did this program assessment rating tool, which is like a color-coded scheme to try and figure out which agencies were doing what the president wanted and which ones weren't, which ones were performing well. And so if you're performing well, you got more money. If you weren't performing as well, you didn't get as much budget increase. So we know that this is a problem. We know that budgets are going out of control in terms of how much we're actually spending, but unlike the state government, the federal government can spend however much it really wants. Now, another big part of this problem about how we make the budget and where the money goes is called uncontrollable expenditures. Uncontrollable expenditures are part of the budget that we can't control. Duh, uncontrollable. Well, what are those? Well, Social Security, veterans benefits, Medicare, Medicaid. Why are they uncontrollable? Well, because when we try to change the law about Social Security benefits, all of the old people come out and say, don't mess with my Social Security. And, there's this expectation that Social Security should be there for people because they paid into the system. Well, just as a side note, Social Security is not a retirement plan. It was a plan designed to help old people to not starve to death, more or less. And when that happened, we had lifespans that were very short. And people would get Social Security and live on Social Security for a very short period of time before they died. Now we're retiring, believing that Social Security is our retirement at 63, and then living until we're 85 or 80. And so for 20 years, we're living on this sort of subsistence, don't die, because you can't eat food, we can't afford to buy food program, and so our expenditures are going through the roof with Social Security. Anyway, so we've made these promises to people about spending money on them. Veterans, obviously, when we borrow money, we have to pay down the debt and we have to at least pay the interest payment. That's an uncontrollable expenditure because we have to pay that. So the portion of the budget that is dedicated to things that we don't control or can't really control very easily, those are uncontrollable. That's down to like 30%. So So sorry, it's gone up to like 70%. So 70% of the things that we spend money on, we don't really have to make those choices. What happens is that the things that we can control, like the budget for the Center of Disease Control and Prevention or the National Park Service, that entire budget that we control is 25 to 30% of our entire federal government spending. So when people talk about how expensive everything is, it's really actually not because of National Park Service or the State Department. It's massive uncontrollable expenditures, like Social Security, welfare, Medicare, Medicaid, and veterans benefits. So as we're trying to negotiate about this very small part of the pie that we can actually control in our expenditures, we sort of end up playing games. Now, like I said before, the president will propose a budget, and then Congress marks those all up to make some changes. So the budget that the president submits is a recommendation, and Congress authorizes expenditures and determine how the taxes are going to be brought in. And so we end up playing these games. Agencies will tell the president that they need more than they actually have, and the president will tell Congress that agencies need more than they actually have, or the president will propose cuts to programs, and Congress will say, oh man, that's not going to work. So there's this negotiation. So here are some of the games that get played in the process. I think of very, very expensive items like purses or guns or things that are really luxury goods. When you are trying to if you're in a marriage like I am, I love my wife, she's very wonderful, but sometimes we want to buy things and we know that the other person's going to react really, really poorly to this request. And this is really similar to like the president and Congress interacting with agencies on budget requests. So one of the games that I think is really interesting is called the rule of anticipated reaction. It goes like this. So imagine that I want to buy a gun, or I want to buy a purse or fancy set of shoes. I might get on the phone with my wife and say, oh dear, I have to tell you, you're going to be really upset with me. I'm so sorry. And she'll say, oh, Tucker, what did you do? And I'll say, well, I spent a lot of money on something. Oh man, what did you spend money on? I bought a new gun. What? A new gun? What are you talking about? Guns are horrible, horrible things, blah, 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 blah. And then she like, rah, 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 rah. So she's mad that I made a purchase, right? Totally fine. It'd be the same if she bought a purse or, some fancy shoes or whatever it was. So honey, I'm so I understand, so sorry that, and then she'll say, well, how much was it? And I'll say something like, $5,000. $5,000! She starts yelling at me because, she doesn't actually do this. I'm just saying that, like, hypothetically. We don't have $5,000. You're going to have to teach extra summer school classes, blah, 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 blah. Our kids aren't going to be able to eat, blah, 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 blah. So she's yelling at me, and I'll say, oh, did I say $5,000? I didn't really mean $5,000. I'm so sorry, honey. I meant it was $3,500. I'm sorry, I misspoke. $3,500 is a whole lot of money. Blah, 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 blah. And she just, like, kind of lays into me. It's not really true. She's a really wonderful woman. This is just hypothetical. Sorry, dear. And then I'll say, well, actually, it really wasn't $3,000. It was just $2,000. $2,000, Tucker, is a lot of money. We don't really have it. I don't like guns. Blah, 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 blah. Okay, yeah, I get it. I'm sorry. And you know what? Actually, it wasn't even $2,000. It was $1,500. Okay, well, $1,500 is a lot of money. It's a lot more money than I need you to spend on something that's not important, like dance lessons for our kids, and, our kids need some new shoes. And I'll say, and, honey, I'll be totally frank with you. You're going to be so happy because it wasn't even $1,500. It was just $800. She'll say something like, oh, well, good. I'm glad it was only $800 because that's something we can manage. Like, I love you, dear. Bye. And hang up the phone. Well, it was always $800. But I knew that she would overreact. And so what I did was I said, oh my gosh, it's going to be way, way more than it is. And then her expectation was it was going to be really, really, really expensive. By the time it wasn't, she was a whole lot happier for me. So that's one of the budget games, and it's called the rule of anticipated reactions. We'll talk about those budget games in just a second.